Feel better.
Thank you. Well, to introduce our keynote speaker, please help me welcome the Honorable, I'm not going to do the air quotes, I just did. The Honorable Tony Davis, who is, according to his bio, a perpetual problem solver and cheerleader for his hometown of Natchitoches, Louisiana, where he leads the Natchitoches Community Alliance Foundation. He's also a member of Bessie and has been with us all day today. Thank you, Tony.
So I think we had two people from District 4, Congressional District 4 earlier, but maybe down to one at this point. But anyway, thank you all today. It's been some wonderful discussion. I really enjoyed my time. I appreciate you all being here with us today, especially considering all the things we've, the adjustments that have been made to be here. Nonetheless, let's move forward with our keynote speaker today. I'm here to introduce Mr. Jake Darden, who's appointed Commissioner of the Division of Administration in January of 2016 by Governor John Bell Edwards. In this capacity, he serves as the state's Chief Administrative Officer. He was elected twice as the state's Lieutenant Governor and previously served 4 years as Secretary of State. Additionally, he had 15 years as State Senator and 3 years as Baton Rouge Metro Councilman. He has given a lifetime of public service to Louisiana. He's an attorney and graduate of Baton Rouge High School, Louisiana State University's Manship School of Mass Communication, and the LSU Law Center. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Commissioner Darden.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Tony. When Janae asked me to do this, we had to jockey my schedule around because we were supposed to be presenting the state's budget today, and that got postponed. So I was available earlier to have spoken in a more traditional keynote time, but unfortunately you got me here at the end of the day, and so you've heard a lot already. And I'll try not to keep you too very long and leave a little time if you want to ask a couple of questions. Back in the early 90s, I was a newly elected Republican state senator from Baton Rouge. On the day before the presidential election, when Bill Clinton was elected the first time, then President George Bush flew into Baton Rouge on his way home to Houston to vote. And I was one of about 10,000 very enthusiastic Republicans who were gathered at the Baton Rouge airport to greet the president as he flew in. I'd gotten there a little early, and this was before 9/11, obviously, and so I had talked to the Secret Service guys who were doing advance work to try and find out what the president's route may be as he came in and left, and they were very helpful because I wanted my children and my wife to have a chance to say hi to the president. So I was up on a podium like this. I gave one of the warm-up speeches. Everybody, I think, knew the president was going to lose, but it was nonetheless a very enthusiastic crowd. He came in and spoke and left exactly where they told me he was going to go. So they were positioned right where I had put them, and you can envision the scene. You've seen it many times where the president walks down a row and hands outstretched, people shaking hands with him. It was just a rope to keep the crowd back in these low security days. And I was watching this develop, and the president was making his way down the line. I had an eye on Kathy and the boys, and it was so crowded she couldn't hold them. They were both just standing there, pressed up against the rope, and when the president got to where they were, he leaned down and he shook hands with both of them and made his way. So I was all fired up, and after the crowd cleared and I caught up with him, I picked up Matthew, who was then about 4 or 5 years old. I said, "Matthew, isn't this great? You got to shake hands with the President of the United States." And he looked at me and said, "I got a great look at his knees." Now, Matthew is now in his early 30s and married and very successful. Hates the fact that I still tell that story, but that was Matthew's perspective on meeting the President of the United States. He got a good look at somebody's knees. Well, I'm going to give you my perspective on this whole redistricting issue. It's going to be based upon my experience with it, and I've had quite a bit of experience with it. Nothing more than that. So I qualify my remarks by telling you it'll be my perspective. I'm not speaking for the administration or the governor. I'm just giving you my sense of this. Earl Long once said that, and I'll lose my voice if I try and get too gravelly, but Earl Long said, "One of these days, Louisiana's going to get good government, and they ain't going to like it." And he may have been right. And so we have to be very careful about the concerns about what good government may bring and whether or not the proposition to convert our way of reapportioning or other redistricting would actually represent good government. You're in the throes of having that discussion. You've got to think about whether or not you're going to get good government if you make a fundamental change, or Louisiana's going to get it if we make a fundamental change in the way we do things. Good government matters, but I would suggest to you that in many respects it's in the eye of the beholder. It depends on what people think good government is. In my first term in the legislature, my friend, the late Armin Brinkhouse, who was chairman of the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee, referred to me and some of my colleagues as good government squirrels. I wore that as a badge of honor because we were trying to do some things that we believe were changes in the way things had been done, and Armin was kind of defending the status quo and gave us that term. Governor Jindal liked to talk about the gold standard of ethics that he brought to Louisiana, which in my view is a very tarnished gold standard. It served a political purpose for him. I don't know that it really represented the gold standard in terms of ethics reform like some people would like to have done. And so the legitimate debate that's taken place is whether or not taking away the redistricting process from the elected representatives of the people and giving it to some other entity really represents good government. I don't know. I'm not sure that it does. I think it probably has the potential to be a lot more on the good government side, but I think it's an area that's ripe for debate. So consider the evolution of, and I think you have to keep this in context, consider the evolution of party politics in Louisiana. For most of the last century, there was no meaningful Republican Party in the state of Louisiana. I think we all recognize that. Governor Edwards the first, elected 4 times, at some point got tired of having to always run in a field where he would beat every Democrat standing, but then still have to have another race against a Republican that was going to be an easy win for him. And he, along with, I think, Pepe Bruno, a Republican in the legislature, decided that closed primaries weren't the way to go, and that we ought to have open primary elections. I think it was Pepe, wasn't it? And so we went to open primaries. Now that's another issue that kind of ties into this as well. Is Louisiana's open primary system really good government? Does it represent a great way to pick our elected officials? Most states have closed partisan primaries, but we have open primaries, and we could argue this is a great way because everybody gets a choice of everybody. You don't have to go through a very partisan process to pick particular candidates. So let me give you a perspective on my first legislative race. And I'm glad my opponent is here, who beat me in 1987, Larry Bankston. I decided to run for the Senate in 1987, kind of out of the blue. Tommy Hudson had represented Baton Rouge in that seat for a while. Larry was a sitting city councilman. He was odds-on favorite to win the race and to succeed Tommy, and I decided, well, I'm going to run. And I decided I would run as a Republican. Well, the Republican Party was very much in its infancy, I would say then, in terms of where it is now, and they had already selected somebody to be the Republican candidate, a guy that nobody knew, nobody had heard of, frankly. But he had been chosen by the faithful few in the Republican Party who get together and make those kind of decisions. And so I was kind of persona non grata in the Republican Party because I decided to run without being the chosen nominee. The district at the time was about 33% black, overwhelmingly Democratic, because there were really not much Republicans there. And I wound up making the runoff, and Larry beat me fair and square, 200 and some odd votes, 200 some odd plus votes in the runoff. So I would have to bide my time. I served on the city council, but I had an eye on running for the Senate again. So the next time there was going to be an election would be 1991 for the 1992 term, but there was going to be reapportionment, redistricting in there in between because the 1990 census occurred. So I kept a wary eye on the legislature as to what was going to happen in these legislative districts, and sure enough, things changed. In that redistricting process, the district where I lived and where I voted wound up not being in the same district that Larry represented. Now, I'm not accusing anybody of any kind of evil motives, but obviously I make this point because there were political influence in there. We were just laughing about it. Larry and I were talking about it. And for the first time, Senator J.E. Jumonville, who represented across the river, Iberville, West Baton Rouge, came into Baton Rouge and took part of Baton Rouge, and coincidentally was where I lived. But part of J.E.'s deal, and this is an interesting sidelight, in addition to taking a little bit of East Baton Rouge Parish, he also managed to pick up the box where Angola is located. a very clever ploy, because in terms of counting the population of a district, you count the people who live there, not necessarily the registered voters. So JE was able to pick up 10,000 voters that he didn't have to worry about serving for the most part, because that was not a constituency he had to deal with, which was pretty clever, I think, on his part. But anyway, I wound up not being in the district where I had run previously. But because the Constitution says you can run in any district that includes part of your former district, I was able to run, and I chose to run in an open seat. The open seat had been left vacant by Ken Osterberger, one of the few Republicans in the Senate at the time, and Ken's district had changed a little bit because of all the maneuvering that took place, and Ken wasn't running. So that meant Ken's district was ripe for the picking, right? And so a lot of his district got moved around because he wasn't going to be there anymore. Now that wound up being a very beneficial district for me, even though I didn't live in it. I was able to run and get elected in that particular district. And to bring both of my two sons into the story, we've always laughed at Election Day 1991 when I got elected, because my then 7-year-old son John went to school in the first grade, and his teacher said to him, John, good luck, I hope your dad wins today. And John's response was, my dad is a victim of reapportionment. He had remembered discussions that he had heard taking place. So we've always remembered that's what he said. But in any event, I didn't consider myself a victim. I thought it was a great opportunity to be able to run. So in that same 1991 period, and I don't have the benefit of hearing everything that you heard today, and I hope I'm not being too repetitive and going through some of these stories on what's taking place, but it's for the purpose of making a point here at the end. That same redistricting, the congressional districts, and that was the redistricting time that created the district that elected Cleo Fields to the House of Representatives, and the very famous Z district, or the Zorro district as it became called, because it literally stretched across North Louisiana, followed the river down south, and then curved to basically pick up as many boxes as were necessary to create a super majority-minority district, to make certain that a black candidate could win, and probably in particular that Cleo could win. Cleo was in the Senate at the time. I think that the initial lines were drawn. And so that district got created, eventually thrown out by the courts, and the court presented its own plan for congressional redistricting. If I remember correctly, Glenn, the legislature then adopted. So I point these stories out because there is no question that individual politics of members absolutely plays on decisions that are made come reapportionment time. But that's really the case in a lot of areas that I'll mention in just a second. So fast forward to the 2000 redistricting challenges, and now I'm in an entirely different role. I'm the chairman of the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee in the Senate. So I'm going to be the one who's going to handle the bills to handle the reapportionment of all these various entities. And so I'm now saddled with the same burden that I claim other people were then saddled with. What do I do to my district, and how is it going to impact me? Well, my district didn't change very dramatically in that entire process, but you've got to remember the shifting dynamics in the state at the time. Mike Foster had been elected governor, a Democrat who turned Republican immediately before the election, and for the first time you had significant Republican influence in the legislature, particularly in the Senate. Heretofore, the Republicans had been in such a minority that their view really didn't matter very much, because there just weren't that many of them. There were good people who were involved, but they were small in number. Well, that changed. And after the 2000 census, there were a lot more Republicans in leadership positions, and I find myself chairing the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee. Now, we needed to create new congressional districts at that time, and we looked to the congressmen to give us their own plans. And they were certainly not bashful about that. All the congressmen had plans on what they wanted to do and how they thought it would impact them. And I would be less than candid if I didn't tell you that there was a great deal of deference given to the congressional desires by the committee and by the legislature as a whole. That doesn't mean that there wasn't some controversy, because as you can imagine, you had members of the legislature, I can think of one in particular, who very much wanted to be a candidate for the United States Congress, but was not able to do so with the lines that were drawn by the incumbent congressman, who also knew that this guy might be interested in running and made sure that the district was not particularly satisfactory to him. There's no question that that entered into the discussion on how those decisions were made. And the vocal, vociferous senator offered his own plan, his own amendments on the floor to try and make it happen, but it wasn't going to happen, because great deference is given to what the committee recommends. And I'm going to touch on this in just a minute. And that's a key important part of this whole discussion about how things happen from a redistricting standpoint. Great power in the Senate and Governmental Affairs Committee and the House and Governmental Affairs Committee, who spend the time to craft these plans and work with everybody to find out what they may want to see happen. Now, one of the things that we had to keep in mind at that time, and I assume you've talked about this term during the course of the day today, and that's retrogression. We had to be very concerned about retrogression. We couldn't go back and minimize the number of minority seats that had been created as a result of previous redistricting efforts. And that was very much a principle that we had to be cognizant of, because we wanted to enact a plan that we felt like would be upheld by the courts. We were not interested in repeating, just passing a plan the way we wanted it, forget whether it's legal or not, we let the courts tell us. We were very cognizant of making sure we passed a plan that was going to pass constitutional muster. So as a result, we wound up very consciously knowing we needed to have 2 majority-minority districts. And in fact, that same theory trickled down to how we were redrawing lines within the legislature itself. And this is the first time I was able to see firsthand what happens when you, and I heard the word PAC being used previously, but when you disproportionately place voters in districts for ensuring a particular population result. And the result was that the districts that we created legislatively wound up creating stronger majority-minority districts, probably more so than were needed to ensure a minority being elected. But the result was, for example, in my district, not because I necessarily was looking to do this, but just out of the sheer movement, because it's like a water balloon. When you squeeze somewhere, it's going to leave places empty and fill up other places. My Senate district wound up being 86% white and larger Republican than it had been when we started. And that was not necessarily my mission, although I will tell you that the pickup that I made that year included some of the boxes that I had lost in the 1990 redistricting. And that was because the district across the river was coming closer in and was coming into that and was being reshuffled. So the result was creating majority-minority districts that were, in my view, overly packed and making for stronger Republican districts out of necessity based upon the way people were registered. Now, at the time, I was quoted as describing the redistricting process like this. I said, this process is very personal and very painstaking. It is particular and it makes people persnickety. And because that's what I was feeling at the time. It was very personal. Everybody wanted to, just as was described earlier, I just need to get this precinct here. I just need to get this box here. I can be contiguous here. And so when you make one move, that domino is going to affect somebody else. So it's a very difficult balancing act. All the while now, remember, in the 2010, after the 2010 census and after the 1990 census, Louisiana was losing congressional seats. So we lost a representative, and so you had to move people into other districts to make up for the fact that they lost their particular representative. Now, my feeble attempt at alliteration a moment ago is even more accurate when you look at the terminology that you've got to keep in mind. And again, I assume you've probably discussed this at some point during the day-to-day, but these are the terms, they all happen to start with C, that you've got to keep in mind when you're dealing with this process. Compactness, making sure you make a district as tight as is possible. Contiguity, contiguous, making sure that something connects. That's why you often have thin lines that you see in gerrymandered districts that connect sometimes bigger geographic places because they have to be contiguous. You can't be like St. Martin Parish in Louisiana and split into two parts that don't touch each other. You got to touch. Continuity. There's an interest in having continuity of what's been there before for voters, which comes into somewhat of a basis of protecting incumbents. You have to have competition. You have to avoid cannibalization where you're taking something from another district just to make it work in this one. And finally, and this is an important phrase, you have to have a community of interest. And this has been the topic of a lot of discussion, is what constitutes that community of interest that to me opens the door for the kind of partisan gerrymandering that often occurs, and it's going to be the subject of this case in the U.S. Supreme Court when they ultimately decide whether it's legal or not to quote, partisanly draw districts to protect Republicans, protect Democrats, whatever the case may be. So, is this process over-politicized? Absolutely. I don't think anybody can deny that this is not a very acute political determination that's made. But so are many of the decisions that legislators make. How votes affect their businesses, how votes may affect their personal income, how votes may affect people who contribute to their campaigns, how votes may mesh or conflict with particular religious beliefs. All those decisions where votes have to be taken are very difficult ones and could be considered over-politicized. Redrawing lines, though, is the most visible one because it just seems to be you're doing something for your self-interest to protect your re-election. Whereas you could argue that every vote you take you're doing to try and do something that's going to protect your ability to be re-elected by trying to please as many people in your constituency as you can. So, what can we expect going forward? I would suggest to you these are the things we've got to be looking at going forward. The prolific growth of the Republican Party, particularly in Louisiana, that's been tempered by people becoming affiliated with no party or becoming independents. That's the fastest growing area of the demographic of Louisiana. It was when I was Secretary of State. I think it's continuing, and I think it's liable to continue even more based upon what's happening at the national level. More people are saying, I don't want to be affiliated with either one of these parties. I want to be independent. I think that's going to continue, and it'll be interesting to see how that drives more candidates who declare to be independent and how that affects the ability of the Democrat and Republican parties to influence particularly these redistricting questions. The hyper-partisanship that exists right now in Washington has found its way to Louisiana, if you haven't noticed, but I'm sure you have. And it is one of the most difficult challenges that we face now as a state, is what I would describe as a hyper-partisan attitude where pleasing your party has become almost as important as pleasing your constituency, if not more so, depending on where your constituency is from a geographic standpoint. The close party margins on the federal level are going to be a huge factor in this discussion, where literally a single election in a district may determine the fate of who controls the House of Representatives of the U.S. Senate. And that's going to continue, I think, as the country remains divided and these races take place, and you see more of a backlash to some extent with the Trump administration. How that's going to play out is going to affect these kind of decisions for redistricting. And finally, perhaps as important as any of these is the Supreme Court decision in the Citizens United case that opened up the door for funding for super PACs. Because super PACs now are no longer going to be relegated to limited campaigns on the federal level. They are now going to be able to exist to influence elections at every level of government, and I would suggest to you that includes decisions that are made relative to redistricting, and I would anticipate you're going to see an awful lot of super PACs formed for the purpose of trying to influence legislative decisions on how you draw these lines. Because how you draw these lines after the next census is going to determine the makeup of the United States Congress. And I think it's going to become very, very political. I read a study that I'm not sure this group is neutral, bipartisan, left-leaning, right-leaning, or what, but it said that in 2014, of the 435 congressional seats that would be up for election, only 39 were truly considered competitive. That dropped to 37 in 2016. And I don't know, again, I don't know the details of what was considered truly competitive or not, but I think that makes the point that the more we draw these districts in a manner that creates super majorities or over majority, minority districts, more Republican districts, for more limited Democrat districts, you're going to have more of this type of lack of competition for the seats. And when there's lack of competition and you represent a narrower constituency, you have to only satisfy a narrow constituency, right? And so that's what's happened, I think, in many respects. That's what happened. We see it in the Louisiana legislature. The district I ran in when I first ran against Larry was 1/3 black and largely Democrat. I was a Republican. I was going to have to serve people of both parties and all kind of different socioeconomic status. I wound up in the new district that was created, the highest per capita income district in the state of Louisiana, representing South Baton Rouge and the LSU area. So that constituency that I served at the time was pretty homogenous for the most part, right? And so you don't have to serve, you don't have to think about issues in terms of a broader base that you're serving a narrower constituency. I don't know if that's a particularly good thing. Okay, and I haven't looked at the details of this, and I hope you talked about this some today, but very cursory research. 21 states have some kind of commissions. I'm not sure how they all operate, and they're all probably structured differently based upon the constitution of a respective state and the political desires of a particular state and the party makeup of a particular state. But generally, the states who have drifted toward these commissions are in the West and tend to be on the East and West Coast, which is traditionally a more liberal or more Democrat-leaning constituency. It fluctuates, moves over a little bit in the northern part of the country to the middle part of America, but by and large, it's a phenomenon that seems to have taken root on the coasts. So the issues that you have to deal with in deciding where you go with this idea of creating some type of a commission to be involved in some manner or form in this process becomes a constitutional debate. It's going to take a constitutional amendment, I think, to do this. And I would stand to be corrected if we think it can be done without a constitutional amendment. But my sense is probably is going to involve the Constitution if you're going to vest some power in someone other than the Louisiana legislature to make an ultimate decision. And just like the debate that is out there about Louisiana needing a constitutional convention, the issue on creating a commission is going to be just like the issue in creating a convention. As the late John Hankel used to say, who's going to pick the pickers? Who is going to decide who gets to be the decision maker? And that's the ultimate question. If the legislature is going to cede some power it has to make the decision itself, who is it going to give the power to? Now, if you look at the State Ethics Board as an example, and I was involved in the creation of the new ethics board that exists now, what was thought to be the right idea was to let college presidents do it, or let universities make recommendations to the legislature as to who the members would be. So the college presidents make recommendations, legislature gets to pick, or the governor gets to pick from those recommendations. The only thing more political than a political body itself is a university. So are you really getting into a more bipartisan and a more independent group when you vest it in the university? I don't know. I'm not sure. But that's the big challenge. Who gets to decide these things and who gets to make these decisions? So finally, and real quickly, let me talk about make some practical political observations about where we're going with redistricting as we move forward with 2020 redistricting. It will be much more sophisticated than in the past. I can't compare it so much to the 2010 because I wasn't involved as a legislator, and I would defer to Glenn and others to challenge what I'm about to say, but I think in 2020, we're going to reach a level of sophistication given computer access and software that's now available that is going to open up a whole universe of people who can be more actively involved in this process. When I did it with Glenn in 2010, you basically worked out of one small office on a floor in the Capitol, and few people would go up there and nose around, but that was the epicenter of redistricting. That's where things happen. That's where Glenn moves precincts around, and you see what happens when you start squeezing that balloon, and very few people participated in that process. I think now, given the degree of sophistication, you're going to see a lot more people and a lot more consultants who are going to claim they can do just what Glenn does, and they can do what legislators are looking to do, so let's come up with our own ideas. There's going to be much more transparency available than just working in that little office. The internet is now going to give everybody access to the thought process, and frankly, I think that's a good thing. I think that ought to be a part of this whole discussion, is that there ought to be more light shown on how this process is created. And that's going to get into legislators' ability to have their work product private until they decide to put it in a bill. But that may be an area that's ripe for discussion about getting more public involvement in the process of how people are going about creating these possible districts. And finally, and this is the most practical reality, I think, is what are those two committees going to look like? What's that Senate Governmental Affairs Committee and that House and Governmental Affairs Committee going to look like? There will be heightened interest, I would suggest to you, after the elections in a year or so, as to who is the President of the Senate and who is the Speaker of the House, even more so than there usually is, because this is going to be a redistricting year. And the President and the Speaker are going to appoint the committee chairs and appoint the committees. And so whoever is President and Speaker is going to have a great deal to say with what those committees are going to look like. The governor obviously would have say too, but only when it comes to a veto. And you veto a bill, you got to start this process all over. I mean, it's going to, no governor wants to have to veto a redistricting bill, I can tell you that. You don't have to do this process again, and you don't want to have to make that happen. But look at the committee makeup that's in place right now. Now, somebody said earlier, these committees are not going to be the ones that are going to redraw the lines. That's true. But these could be the committees that could consider a bill to create a commission in this legislative session. And I don't know to what extent anybody has come forward and said we want to do that now, or that this group thinks it's ready to go advance a plan. It doesn't seem like that's the case. But the current legislature could absolutely file bills right now to create a commission before their term ends in a year or two. But if you look at the committee right now, and just as an example, just to show you how important makeup is, the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee right now is chaired by Karen Carter Peterson. She is a black Democrat from New Orleans who also happens to be the chairman of the Democratic Party in Louisiana. So she's got all kinds of groups that she could be said to want to serve from a geographic standpoint, a racial standpoint, and a political standpoint. The vice chairman is Wesley Bishop, a black Democrat from New Orleans. You have on that committee two other black Democrats from New Orleans, Troy Carter and J.P. Morrell. You have a term-limited Republican from the North Shore, Jack Donahue. You have three white Republicans from North Louisiana, Neil Reiser, Mike Walsworth, and Jim Fannin. And you have Greg Tarver, a black Democrat from Shreveport, who's been on the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee since the Claiborne administration, I think. He's a fixture there. But so the makeup of this committee, I mean, you look at that makeup and you say, all right, now where's the interest lie? You can make arguments that it's overly New Orleans. You can make an argument that it's overly Democrat. You can make an argument that it's overly black in terms of trying to make these decisions. But that's what you got to look at, who's going to be on the committee. The House committee, it looks completely different, not surprisingly. The chairman is a Democrat from the Lake Charles area who's running for mayor of Sulphur, so he's going to be gone, presumably, if he wins within the next year. There's a Republican from the North Shore as vice chairman. There are two black Democrats from New Orleans, and that's the extent of the New Orleans representation on a much larger committee. You have 2 white Democrats from the north and the central part of the state, and you have Lance Harris, who's the chair of the Republican caucus in the legislature, and you have 4 other Republicans, a couple of them from North Louisiana. Now, I don't want to, so the primary considerations, I mentioned this already, but think about this. There are geographic interests to be served for a constituency, party issues to be served, or party constituency to be considered, race because of the need to have minority districts, and also term limits. Because if you're term limited, you are expendable in this process. Your influence on the process is greatly marginalized if the members know you're term limited, because you don't have any interest in protecting your own interest anymore. So those districts become ripe for the taking, and I dare say that's where a lot of the discussion starts on how to draw these lines as you look at those people who aren't going to be there. And Glenn is not acknowledging that, but I'm telling you that's going to be part of what will happen. So you have to look at that, and there have been 35 House members in the Louisiana legislature who have moved to the Senate since term limits took place in the 4 or so elections that have taken place since then. So you have a lot of House members who are going to have a real interest in what those Senate districts look like. And I'm telling you, that didn't used to be the case in the good old days. The Senate did its districting and the House did its districting, and you stayed out of each other's business. That bill came over from the other chamber, and you didn't mess with it very much. It was very unusual, I think, that you would do that. But now, got a lot of interest on both chambers of what those other districts look like, because term limits is going to take me out of this chamber, but I got to find a way I can get in the other chamber. So that becomes an interest group as well as party, geography, and race. So the reality in the next term, my sense is you're going to have, I believe, probably more Republicans in the legislature. You're going to have more money absolutely driving decisions because of the rulings that have opened up the ability to spend money. And you're absolutely going to have a whole lot of new legislators. That observation was correct. You have a massive number of term-limited legislators with an awful lot of institutional knowledge about this process who are going to be gone. And so one of the first challenges for these new legislators is going to be this mess that you can see is a mess and a difficult, thorny problem to kind of deal with. So, but that also makes this issue one that's ripe for political discussion come election time. And that may be the best thing that your group can do at this stage of the game, is to try and get active enough to say, we ought to be asking questions of legislators how they feel about redistricting and what will be their motivation in trying to accommodate it. Finally, I would say to you, just listening to the tail end of the discussion last time, one of the things that I think ought to be done for sure is there ought to be a requirement to pre-file redistricting bills much earlier than the pre-filing date that's now required, if that isn't being done already, so that at least the bills as drafted can get a look-see by the public sooner. But that doesn't mean those bills are going to stay in their same form, obviously. They can be totally changed, but at least it would spur some discussion much earlier. But remember, if a commission's appointed or whatever citizen engagement is encouraged and happens, is going to bring the same type of partisan possibilities that exist in the minds of legislators. You open it up to groups to be involved, and they're going to have party alignments, they're going to have geographic alignments, they're going to have racial alignments, and that's going to affect them as well. I didn't mention it at the time, but the big debate on congressional redistricting, as I recall last time, was, are we going to combine North Louisiana? Because the population is not in North Louisiana. You could theoretically draw a congressional district that stretches across the northern part of the state, east to west. But that's heresy to North Louisiana legislators. Monroe wants a district and Shreveport wants a district, and they don't claim to have a community of interest. But to do that, you had to do some machinations in the South that wound up having Jeff Landry and Charles Boustany running against each other, which is not what they wanted, I can assure you, but that's what happened. And so every time you make a move, that's something's going to be affected. So I just make that point because there'll be similar pressure on a commission that's created, just like there would be on legislators. So I want to close with several quotes that I think are appropriate to this process. Some of my favorites. The first one is from Groucho Marx, who said, "I would never join any club that would have me as a member." Legislators don't feel the same way about that. They're happy to be in that club, whether people want them in there or not. P.J. O'Rourke said, "Giving money and power to government is like giving whiskey and car keys to a teenage boy." That is a truism as well. But more to the point of how it affects this redistricting question, another Groucho. "Politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it wrongly, and applying unsuitable remedies." That's what could happen, potentially, if you don't have the right remedy for a problem that you're trying to fix. So you have to go very careful in doing this. And this is H.L. Mencken. "Democracy is the art and science of running the circus from the monkey cage." That's kind of like the whiskey one as well. But the one I will close with, and I think we should all be grateful for, is a Winston Churchill who said, "Democracy is the worst form of government, except all other forms of government." And so we got the best form going with a representative democracy and a representative republic that involves electing people to make these tough decisions for us. And I think we have to keep that in mind as we go through this debate as well. So with that, I'll stop and thank you for your attention late in the day. And if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them. I don't know that I have any more wisdom than what you've heard already.
Just given your that's a pretty loud microphone. Given your experience with redistricting, you listed your alliterated C principles of redistricting, and we heard pretty much every speaker talk about those in one way or another. In your experience, and as somebody who's relatively moderate politically, maybe trying to go in that direction, what would be your priorities of those C words that you mentioned? Do you have an order you would put them in?
No, I don't have any particular order, but I would tell you that, start with contiguous. You got to have contiguous, but that's from a legal standpoint, just a practical standpoint. That's got to be at the top of the list, because you can't start just plucking from everywhere. You got to have be contiguous. I think compactness would come second in my view, trying to make districts as tight as possible, and districts that when you look at a map you say, well, that makes some sense. And we haven't always succeeded at that, as you can tell if you look at any of these redistricting maps. But I'd say compactness would be second, and community of interest would probably be third, which would kind of catch the politics and the requirement to have the right racial balance because of Supreme Court decisions.
Going once? All right.
All right, well, thank y'all very much.
We're going to run right into our last segment. We want to thank Commissioner Darden for coming by and giving us the keynote address. And thank you for staying with us for what was a long, but I hope you... Last speaker to give the closing remarks is Barry Irwin, who runs CABLE, the Council for a Better Louisiana. And Barry's always good at leaving things, maybe not necessarily on a high note, but on several notes. He usually leaves you depressed at the end of the day. But in an honest way.
Well, thank you so much.
I know him very well. So Barry is also a former journalist, and like a keen journalist, he's been observing all day and is now going to give us his digested wisdom. Barry.
There you go. How encouraging. So greetings. So y'all ready to move into phase 2? Yeah, right. They asked me real quickly to do a little overview and just some kind of closing thoughts. So it's like those YouTube videos where you get the history of the world in 1 minute. So here's what I got out of this thing today. We all want fair districts, but fair is in the eye of the beholder. Drawing congressional districts is like being in a knife fight. Can legislators draw fair districts? According to one legislator, it's possible. There's lots of politics in redistricting. It's very complicated, but that notwithstanding, we do elect a certain number of knuckleheads to the legislature. That was a legislator who said that, who are sometimes the windshield and sometimes the bug. The legislators are open to looking at other plans, but it's their show and they're going to run it. And finally, on this very uplifting note, from Representative Tim James, the new maps will be drawn by a group of legislators who don't know where the bathroom is. So that's kind of my take on where we are. Seriously though, I mean, I think this has been a really great opportunity to have a discussion that we need to have in our state. And believe it or not, look at the week that we have had in our state. Look at what happened last night with the change of venue. And look, y'all are all still here, and some of you still have a long ways to go back. So obviously, this is an issue that is of interest to people in our state, and is one that I think we're going to see from here going forward. But the big question is, what are the next steps? We didn't really talk too much about that, and I don't know that we know what the next steps are, but we heard some ideas, some things that came out. One of them, of course, is maybe a resolution, maybe the legislature to do something with something informal or advisory or whatever to help recommend or have some citizen input, transparency into the process of redrawing districts. Another is something Representative James said about something maybe organic. Anybody can do this. We heard about the computer software, the technology, all of those things. It's much more affordable and easy to actually do some of these things as an independent group. That's an opportunity as well. But whatever it is, this is only the first step. Other states are going through this right now. We've already heard about how some of those have grappled with it. But the big question is really, I think, up to the people in this room. What is step 2? I don't know the answer to that, but I will say this. Y'all have been here through an entire day full of interesting discussion on this, and I think that there's plenty of food for thought and a lot of things to ponder. And I would just end on giving yourselves a round of applause for a big, long day and for the commitment and passion you have to exploring this issue even further. So thanks very much.